Hello everyone, Assalamu alaikum. I'm Dina Akasha and I'm back again with my educational videos. And today's topic is about the subject of the formula. And to be very specific, as the subject of the formula topic has three cases, today we are going to discuss the questions in which the letter we are required to make subject will be repeated, if the letter is repeated. But first, let's just take an example on the basic questions related to the subject of the formula and understand what is meant by this sentence over here. Now, if I have this equation, for instance, y equals mx plus c. Now, if you've noticed that I mentioned the word equation and I said that this is an equation. Now, this is an equation. Why? Because simply it has an equal sign. But why am I allowed to call it a formula as well? I'm allowed to call it a formula because it has so many letters, as you can see. So basically, the formula is an equation with several letters. Now, what do I mean by the subject of the formula? The subject means what is the letter that stands alone on one side of the equation and the coefficient of this letter is positive 1. ببساطة شديدة جدا مين اللتر اللي هو في ناحية لوحده ولازم يكون الرقم اللي على شماله positive 1. Since y, or to be very specific, since positive 1y is on the left-hand side of this equation and all the letters are on the other side, so in this case I can say that y is subject of the equation. Y is subject of the equation, or y is the subject of the formula. Now let's assume the question doesn't require that the formula to be y equals, it requires that the formula changes into x equals, or in other words, I am required to make x subject. X subject means that I want the x standing alone on one side with the coefficient of positive 1. Okay, now if you look at the right-hand side, which is the side that contains the letter x, there is the letter m, which is multiplied, and there is the letter c, which is added. Now, how do I solve basic questions related to the subject of the formula? We deal with it as if I am dealing with an equation. And actually, there was a separate video on these sort of questions. This is just a reminder. So basically, I will subtract c from both sides of the equation or formula, or I will move the c by subtraction to the other side, because as we said, it's how we deal with equations. You start by the weak operation, ببتدي دايما بالoperation الضعيفة. And then since the m is multiplied, then I divide by m. So the final answer would be, and I move the m to the other side by division. So x would be y minus c over m. And this is just a basic reminder of the subject of the formula. Now, our topic, or the subject of the formula topic, actually ده من الدروس اللي أنا بحبها، درس لذيذ يعني وقصير ولطيف. Now, as for the subject of the formula, we have three cases. Now we have the basic case, or letter, not repeated, okay, which was discussed in a previous video. And then we have the letter repeated, which is what we're going to discuss today. معلش يا جماعة الخطي معلش برضو مأساة. And then we have the quadratic questions. And this will be discussed in the completing the square. Now, let's just I'm just going to, I have a point. I want to give you another example over here. لو أنا جيت قلت لكم مثلا حاجة زي كده 3y minus 2 equals, for example, to 4y, لا 4y أو لا مش 4y خليها بس مثلا 2y plus 3x حاجة زي كده. And I am required to change this into y equals. And مثلا هنا in this question, I want y to be subject. خلي دي معلش 5y. Okay? هتقولي لي يا مس طب ما هنا letter repeated. y هنا y هنا. But let's see. Now in this question, what is the trick that I can do? I can combine the y's on one side of the equation. And then I will move the 2 to the other side. So it changes into 3x plus 2. Now, when you look at the left-hand side over here, you'll see that the y's, they can be combined. يعني I can combine them in this case. I can just subtract the coefficients. فدي هتبقى هنا 3y equals to 3x plus 2. And then as for the final answer, of course, since the 3 is multiplied, I move it by division. So I end up with 3x plus 2 over 3. فالexample ده بيتدرج تحت letter not repeated. ليه بقى؟ لأنه when I combined these two terms that have the letter y on one side, I was able to combine them. طيب, what if I am not able to combine them? And this is what we are going to discuss over here. What if I was not able to combine them? Okay, now I'm going to move on to the classified part 1. Okay, if you are going to use my resources, this is classified part 1, page number 42. Classified part 1, page number 42. And what are we discussing? We are discussing how to make a letter subject if this letter is repeated. Let me just erase this. If the letter is repeated, or repeated, and this letter has the same power, I'll show you now. أنا بحب دايما أدي كل التفاصيل بصراحة. And this letter can't be combined. زي ما عملنا في الإكزامبل اللي فات. في الإكزامبل اللي فات, I was able to combine the y's together. Okay? But now we are going to discuss the questions in which, please pay attention, a letter is required to be subject. Let me just zoom out. This letter is repeated, as you can see. This letter is repeated. So as you can see, this letter is repeated, but and the letter has the same power, which is power 1 in both sides of the equation, but this letter cannot be combined. So what do I do in this case? أنا هقولها بالعربي الأول لأن أنا صراحة بقولها بطريقة لذيذة كده. Okay? Now, first of all, whenever you're dealing with these sort of questions, you have 3 steps that you need to remember. فك البراكت. 2. لم العيلة. 3. خدها common. فدي ال 3 steps اللي احنا هنتعامل بيها لما بنشتغل في المسائل بتاعة ال subject of the formula letter repeated. فك bracket, لم العيلة, خدها common. The 3 steps that I strongly recommend that you use whenever you're dealing with these sort of questions is expand. Let me just, معلش يا جماعة والله my handwriting is miserable. Expand the brackets. طبعا if the question contains a bracket, collect the family on one side, and I'll show you now, and then take common. These are the 3 steps that you follow. Expand the bracket, collect the family, take common. فك bracket, لم العيلة, take it common. Now, as you can see in this question over here, I don't have a bracket to expand. So I skip step number 1. Step number 2, لم العيلة, or collect the family. I am required to make G subject. What does that mean? It means that I am going to collect all the terms that contain the G on the left-hand side, and any terms that don't contain the G on one side. لم العيلة, أنا العيلة عندي اللي هي أي term فيه letter G. فأحط الجيهات مع بعض. هجيب دي كده هنا عند أختها. So I end up with G minus GH. Oh, please, يا جماعة, I need to remind you that this is considered as one item. So I move it as a whole. And then what do I do next? Any term that doesn't contain the letter G, to be moved to the right hand side of the equation. Okay, فمثلا هنا عندي ال 3h اهو في مكانها، ال minus 1 هيروح لها as plus 1. So this is what I do, rearranging of your formula so that you collect any term that contains g on one side and any other term that doesn't contain the g on the right hand side. اهو دي الستep الأولانية. So I didn't expand the bracket because I didn't have. Okay, عملنا step number 2 اللي هي لم العيلة. Now what is step number 3, which is خدها common? Now if you look at these two terms, you will find that we cannot combine them. And making G subject معناها إيه؟ معناها إن أنا I want one G on one side and everything else on the other side. This is what G subject means. فأنا بقى هنا, what do I do بقى in this case? هنعمل إيه بقى دلوقتي? In this case over here, I will take G common. I will take G common. أهي. Take G common. Let me just rewrite this. Open bracket. And keep the right hand side as it is. طبعا taking G common, this is going to be super easy. Term minus the term. Please remember, when you take common, to fill in inside the bracket, you divide by the common factor. So G over G, which is 1. And then GH divided by G is just H. Okay? دايما يا جماعة في الكومن احنا بنديفايد G divide by G is 1. أو هنا كمان ممكن أفكر بيها بطريقة تانية. لو أنا أخدت G من هنا هيتبقى لي إيه؟ هيتبقى لي H. So this is taking common. Now, what is the final step? The final step is the final answer. Now, since this bracket is multiplied with the G, so in order to remove the bracket and move it to the other side of the equation, I divide. And please remember, يا جماعة, إنه to eliminate any term of the equation, we do it by division. So we do it by the inverse operation. So since the bracket is multiplied, it moves by division. يبقى the right hand side will remain as it is, and then I divide by the bracket. طبعا أنا حبيت أبتدي ب simple example اللي هو ما فيهوش الحتة بتاعت فك bracket, and then we're going to move on with the examples. يعني هنشوف more examples. Okay, now moving on to more examples related to the subject of the formula. And let's check this example over here. This is in the same classified page number 43. Same classified page number 43. And I'm going to add some notes, يعني some hints كده, that might help you solve these sort of questions. Please يا جماعة, always in algebra, always remember to put brackets around terms to avoid silly mistakes. Always put brackets to avoid silly mistakes. The second thing that I want you to remember, which is super important whenever you're dealing with algebra, is if you have a fraction, F stands for fraction, and if you have an equal sign and another fraction, if you have two fractions and an equal sign in between, please remember that the first step is going to be cross multiplication. Always remember to cross multiply. هتيجي تقولوا لي بس miss هنا in this question مفيش fraction on the left hand side. Actually, yes. Anything over 1 could be written as a fraction. So what are the algebra concepts that I want you to remember whenever you are dealing with any algebraic questions? First, as we said, put brackets to avoid silly mistakes because it helps with silly mistakes. And then when you have two fractions and an equal sign in between, remember that your first step will always and forever be cross multiplication. And let's see, how do I cross multiply in algebra? These two multiply together, A times D equals these two multiply together, B times C. And what is the reason of cross multiplication? The reason of cross multiplication is just to eliminate the fraction, and that you would have a horizontal equation تقدروا تشتغلوا عليها. أنا ليه أصلاً بعمل cross multiplication؟ بعمل cross multiplication علشان أتخلص من الفراكشن وأقدر أشتغل. So let's write the steps of letter repeated. Let's try the steps of letter repeated. Okay, the steps of letter repeated are فك bracket, expand the bracket, and you will notice this now. 2 لم العيلة, collect the family. 3 خدها common, take common. So as we said here, what we did initially is that I put the brackets. Now I'm going to cross multiply. Please remember, when you cross multiply, these two multiply together. So this is step number 1. Y, open bracket, cx plus d equals, these two multiply together, 1 times ax plus b. So as you can see now, it changed into an equation, so I can easily deal with it. Okay, so after cross multiplication, I will expand the bracket. I must expand the bracket. وادي step number 1. يبقى امتى بقى بنعمل فك براكت؟ بنعمل فك براكت لما يكون المسألة فيها cross multiplication. Y times cx is ycx, cxy, whatever order of the letter, it doesn't matter. Plus y times d is dy or yd. Equals, of course, 1 times the bracket is the bracket as it is. يبقى step number 1, cross multiplication. Step number 2, expand the bracket. Now step number 3, let's deal with it now, which is لم العيلة. I am required in this question over here, as you can see, to make x subject. Now, where are the terms that contain the letter x? أهم. 2 terms that contain the letter x. فادي العيلة. هي دي العيلة بتاعتي. فأعمل إيه بقى؟ أحط الإكسات مع بعض. Collect the terms that contain the x on one side. So ycx as it is. And then when I move this term, please remember it moves as a whole. طبعا this term is positive, so I move it as negative. أهو. دي الستep بتاعت لم العيلة. أو الستep بتاعت collect the family. And then all the terms that do not contain the letter x, put them on the other side. خلاص. هاخد بقى دي أوديها هنا. كده. So b minus dy. And then what do I do in step number 4? Since I am required to make x subject, and again, x subject means that I must have 1x on one side and everything else on the other side. Now, in this example over here, unlike the one that we did in the whiteboard, خليني بس أفكركم باللي عملناه في الوايت إن إحنا in the example of the whiteboard, I was able to combine these 2 terms by subtraction. فما كانش عندي مشكلة. But in this question over here, I am not able to combine these 2. The only way in which I will have 1x is by taking the x common. So I take x common. I take x common in the same way in which I solve highest common factor questions. So when I take x common from this term, what remains is yc or cy. When I take x common from this term, what remains is a. Okay? And then the last step, which is step number 5, is the FA. And of course, I guess you know what are these letters, what do these letters stand for? FA means the final answer. Now, the final answer must be x equals. The final answer must be x equals. So in this case, the x is multiplied with the bracket. I need to remove the bracket from this side. So what do? The right-hand side will remain as it is since the bracket is multiplied. So I move it by division and move the whole bracket. So I end up with yc minus a. And there goes your final answer over here. There goes your final answer over here. Okay. Now, sometimes the questions contain operations, like this example over here. Okay. Now, as you can see, what is extra in this question? Now, the extra thing is the power 2, is the square root, I'm sorry. Now let me remind you of something, that لو أنا جيت قلت لكم مثلا square root x is equal to 3 and I am required to find the value of x. طبعا what we do over here to eliminate the square root, you have to use the inverse operation, which is power 2. So basically, I power 2 both sides of the equation, and I end up with x equals to 9. تمام؟ This is the correct method. طبعا احنا احيانا بقى بنعمل ايه بقى؟ يعني السرعة في الأداء كده بس عشان نبقى بنسهل في الحل شوية. Okay. لو أنا جيت قلت لكم square root x is equal to 3, what I do is that I move the square root to the other side by squaring. I move the square root to the other side by squaring. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that the inverse operation of power 2, of square root is power 2, and the inverse operation of power 2 is square root. Now, in this case, I can never cross multiply first. Why? Because as you can see, there is this root symbol over here. I can only cross multiply immediately if the fractions are free. لو الفractions لوحدها زي كده بالظبط A على B equals C على D. In this case, I can easily cross multiply. But if there is a root, I can never do that. I must eliminate the root first. So in this question, I must eliminate this root. طبعا الصح بيقول إن إحنا we square both sides of the equation. ده الماث الصح. تمام. طبعا I end up with the following: x squared equals لأنه ده هيشيل ده. Okay. I end up with 2b minus a over 7 minus am. طبعا this is the correct mathematical approach. Or طبعا sometimes we just do it this way. يعني إنه if you want to move or get rid of the square root, you inverse the operation. So you square it. So I square it. Okay. So I end up with x power 2. Same, يعني I will end up with the same answer. Let me just rewrite this كده with different color. And I will call this as step number 1. So I end up with x squared equals 2b minus a over 7 minus am. So from here, I can write this tip that says you can't cross multiply unless the fractions are free. مفيش حاجة كاتمة على نفسها، مفيش root كده زي ده. And then, as we said earlier, always remember to put brackets to avoid silly mistakes. These are the algebra concepts that you must always remember. Step number 2, fraction equal fraction, and anything over 1 could be written as a fraction. Fraction equal fraction. Please remember that you always cross multiply. And how do I cross multiply in algebra? These two multiply together. So x squared multiplied by this denominator. Okay. ليه بقى أنا بقول لكم حطوا bracket؟ لأنه في ناس بقى تقوم عاملاها كده. أهو. فينسوا بقى تماما يعملوا لي x power 2 times 7 وينسوا الباقي. So this is why I insist on the brackets. And of course, the operation between x power 2 and the bracket is times. Equals, these two multiply together. 1 times 2b minus a. So this is step number 1. Here, step number 1 is remove the root. Step number 2 is cross multiplication. And then please remember the 3 basic steps of letter repeated, same power. فك bracket, لم العيلة, خدها common. So the following step must be expanding of the bracket. So x power 2 times 7 is 7x squared. مش x squared 7. Please remember to write the number first. X power 2 times am is minus amx squared. Equals, of course, 1 times the bracket will be the bracket as it is. So this is the step of expanding the bracket, or what we call focal bracket. And then this is the most important step, and I'm actually going to use another color for it, اللي هي the step of لم العيلة. أو collect the family, or in other words, collect. طبعا هنا I am required to make a subject in this question. So all the terms that will contain the letter A must be collected on one side. So any term that contains the letter A must be collected on one side and anything else on the other side. So basically, I'm just going to do some rearranging. The green will be on the left-hand side. And please remember that when you move a letter, you inverse the operation. So negative A changes into positive A, and then this term remains as it is. And then the yellow will be collected together on the right-hand side. So 2b minus 7x squared. This is the step of لم العيلة. Please remember that the A is subject. Okay, you are required to find a subject. After we did the لم العيلة step, what do I do next? I take com. خدها com. Meaning that in step number 5, I'm going to take the letter A as a common factor. So A open bracket equals the right-hand side as it is, 2b minus 7x squared. Now, remember that when you fill inside the bracket, you divide. So A divided A is 1. And then this term divided by A is mx squared. Now, خلاص, what remains is the final answer, which is step number 6. Okay, اللي هي A equals. Now, since the A is multiplied, the bracket, so I move the bracket as a whole by division. I move it by division, so I end up with 2b minus 7x squared over 1 minus mx squared. وكده خلصت وصح 100%. أنا بس عايزة أقول حاجة هنا صغيرة عشان بس ما بقاش إن أنا ما قلتش المعلومات كلها، إنه أحيانا الولاد في ستيب نمبر 3 بيعكسوا، يعني يعملوا إيه مثلا؟ يودوا دي هنا كده. اوكي، يعني ما يحطوش الايهات على الناحيه الشمال، يحطوها على الناحيه اليمين، ويقوموا ايه مودين دي هنا ويجيبوا دي هنا كده مثلا، يعملوها كده. So if you actually decide to do this, so what will happen? You will get another answer, which is A equals 7x squared minus 2b over mx squared minus 1. Now, if you get this answer, you will find that these two, they are exactly the same. How do I know that these two they are exactly the same? ال7 هنا negative بقت positive. ال2b positive بقت negative. دي negative هنا positive وده positive قلب negative. If all the signs are reversed, then your answers are the same. Then your answers are exactly the same if all the signs are reversed. Okay? Now, one last example, and now I'm going to move on to the notes بقى المرة دي. In this question over here, برضو نفس الفكرة في المسائل بتاعت اللي هي letter repeated. But there is just another difference, very, very small difference over here related to this question. هنا بيقول لي given that y is positive, given that y is positive, and I actually need to remind you of something that whenever you have this simple equation, y power 2 is equal to 9. And for instance, I am required to find the value of y. So what I do is that I square root طبعا. Now, the answer is not just going to be the positive root of 9. It's going to be the positive root of 9 and the negative root of 9. So the answer would be positive 3 and negative 3. And sometimes we write it this way, positive and negative 3. But if the question states a condition بالشكل ده, that means that I will only select the positive answer. I will select the positive answer. So please remember, with quadratic equations, there is a whole video about quadratic equations. This is a quadratic equation. You mainly have two answers. Okay, so in this very specific case, you have the positive and the negative root. But if the question says that you are only required to find positive value, فدي كده will be excluded. Now, how do I apply this in an algebraic question? In a subject of the formula algebraic question, let's see and let's practice together. Here it says, given that y is positive, make y subject. إيه يا مس ده? You just said earlier that we are going to be dealing with letter repeated, same power. يعني المسائل اللي احنا حليناها كلها من شوية كانت مسائل كلها power 1 power 1 power 1. طيب here this y is power 1 وهنا this y is power 2. صبر، اصبروا على رزقكم. تمام. What do I do بقى هنا first? Now of course not all questions will contain fractions. يعني مش كل المسائل بيبقى فيها cross multiplication ولا كل المسائل بيبقى، يعني كل مسألة بقى على حسب. Okay. Now please remember that you cannot deal with anything under the root unless you eliminate this root first. طبعا as we said, to eliminate the root you either square both sides, which is الماث الصح, or you can just move it to the other side by squaring. So you end up with y squared equals ay squared plus n. So now this is a question in which the letter is repeated with the same power. بس احنا we did not do this yet. So now we have the same power. Type. How do I continue from there? To continue from there, you have to check the 3 steps that we said. فك bracket لم العيلة خدها common. I don't have any brackets to expand. So here I will move on to the لم العيلة على طول. I must collect all the terms that contain the letter y on one side. So I will move this term as a whole. So I will end up with y squared minus ay squared equals to n. Y squared minus ay squared equals to n. And then let me highlight the letter required as subject. I will take the letter common. طيب هنا بقى in this case, do I take just y while I take y squared? No, I take y squared. Deal with it as you are dealing with highest common factor questions. As if you are dealing with highest common questions. So I take the letter as it is. I take the letter as it is common. So I end up with y squared, open bracket, equals to n. Okay, now let's see. So y squared divided y squared is 1 minus this term over here divided y squared is a. Okay, يبقى أنا if the letter I am dealing with has a power, whether it's power 2, طبعا it must be the same power in both letters. Must be the same power in both letters. I take the letter بالpower بتاعه. I take the letter بالpower بتاعه. Okay, now step number 4 is the objective, which is making y subject. Now to make y subject means I want one y only on one side. So I have the bracket, which is multiplied, and then I have this power 2. Now, subject of the formula is an application of solving linear equations. You always start with the weaker operation. Now, to compare between the multiplication and the power, the multiplication is weaker. So I must move the bracket first. I must move the bracket first. And since the bracket is multiplied, so I move it by division. And then I remove this power 2. Now, what is the inverse of power 2? Square root. So y فالpower 2 دي هتروح هنا as square root. Positive and negative. طب root ايه؟ root الناحية اليمين كلها. root الناحية اليمين كلها بأيا كان اللي فيها. Okay? So I move the power 2 or طبعا عشان نبقى بنتكلم math صح، الصح بيقول ايه؟ ان انا I square root both sides. I square root both sides, or you move this to the other side by rooting, square root, and I move the whole right hand side ايا كان اللي جواه. Type it moves as positive negative, but since the question over here says y is positive, so I don't take the plus and minus, I just take the positive root only, and there goes your final answer. There goes your final answer. I hope that this video was useful to you concerning the subject of the formula letter repeated. Now, the quadratic case will be discussed in, and let me just show you, it will be discussed in completing the square. Quadratic case is a case like this, مثلا, for example. حاجة زي كده. And here it says make x subject, but you can see that the x here is power 2 and the x here is power 1. This is to be solved by completing the square, and completing the square will be discussed in a totally different video. So this is what we discussed today. Letter repeated, same power. I hope that this video was useful to you. If you wish to practice more on subject of the formula letter repeated, you can solve in classifieds part 1 and part number 3. And if you wish to find which pages exactly, please refer to the index in the classified. Thank you all for listening, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.